The HOA notice arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, printed on stiff, official-looking paper stamped with a seal that screamed trouble. Jake nearly tossed it into the junk pile with the usual HOA nonsense about lawn care or mailbox rules, but as he skimmed the opening lines, his coffee mug almost slipped from his hand. "Dear homeowner," it began, "as per HOA regulations, all dogs exceeding 20 pounds are hereby prohibited from residing within the community. Compliance is mandatory, effective immediately." His heart thudded as he reread it, hoping he'd misread, but the words stood firm. His golden retriever, Max, was suddenly illegal. For a moment he stood frozen, staring at the page while Max sat at his feet, tail wagging, blissfully unaware. The sheer absurdity washed over him like a wave. He'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, Max by his side for 4, and they'd never caused a ripple of trouble. Yet here was this rule, banning his best friend over some arbitrary weight limit. It was laughable, infuriating, and worst of all, personal. He knew exactly who was behind it. Karen, the neighborhood's self-crowned HOA tyrant, a woman who could turn a misplaced trash bin into a Shakespearean tragedy. She'd long ruled the community with an iron fist, her smug face plastered across the Facebook group for policing grass heights with a ruler or shamming someone's unapproved patio furniture. Now it seemed she'd turned her gaze to pets, and Max was her first target. Jake stormed onto his porch, half expecting to see her lurking, and there she was, watering her pristine lawn with a grin that could curdle milk. "Oh, Jake," she cooed, setting down her watering can as if she'd rehearsed the moment. "I assume you got the notice." He clenched his jaw, barely containing the fire in his chest. "You can't be serious, Karen." She gasped, all mock innocence, clutching her chest like a soap opera star. "I don't make the rules, Jake. The HOA board does. We all agreed large dogs aren't suitable anymore. Barking, shedding, taking up space, it's a nuisance." He pointed at her oversized poodle, Oliver, sprawled on her porch like a furry king. "What about him?" Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, Oliver's grandfathered in. He's been here longer than the rule." Jake's blood pressure spiked. It was nonsense, a loophole tailored just for her. "That's not how rules work," he snapped. "Well, that's how our rules work," she replied, tilting her head with that infuriating calm. "It's nothing personal, just about keeping things orderly." He could hear the unspoken truth. It's about control. Before he could say something he'd regret, he turned back inside, but the fight was far from over. That night he pored over the HOA bylaws, hunting for any crack to save Max, but found nothing, no loopholes, no mercy. The next morning he dragged himself to the HOA meeting in the community center, a beige-walled room reeking of stale coffee and petty power plays. Karen sat at the head of the table like an empress flanked by board members who either feared or owed her. When they opened the floor, Jake didn't hesitate. "This dog ban is ridiculous," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. Karen barely glanced up from her papers. "I'm sorry, but the board's decided." "It's not a decision, it's a dictatorship," he shot back. "There was no vote. You're enforcing a rule that benefits you and screws the rest of us." Greg, an older board member, shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just Karen's call, Jake. We discussed it. There have been complaints about large dogs." "From who?" Jake demanded, arms folded. Silence hung heavy, and Karen's pen tapped her clipboard with a smug rhythm. Jake stood in the community center, the tension thick as Karen tapped her pen, her smile a mask of unshakable confidence. "Let's not get caught up in specifics," she said smoothly, brushing off his demand to know who'd complained about large dogs. "The rule stands." Frustration clawed at him. He scanned the room for support, but most homeowners avoided his gaze, worn down by years of Karen's reign. "You can't just change rules overnight," he pressed. "What about those of us with dogs already?" "Max isn't hurting anyone." Karen's voice dripped with fake sympathy. "We're giving you a grace period, a few weeks to make arrangements. I'm sure you can find a loving home for Max outside the community." Jake's teeth ground together. She acted like rehoming his dog was as simple as donating old clothes. He saw the futility in arguing further. Karen had the board in her pocket, and the neighbors were too tired to fight. With no immediate solution, he left the meeting, the weight of his next decision pressing down hard. By nightfall, he'd made the call he dreaded most, to his brother who lived just beyond the HOA's reach. "Can Max stay with you for a bit?" he asked, voice tight. His brother agreed, sensing the strain, and Jake assured him it was temporary, though a hollow ache told him otherwise. The day he packed Max's things was brutal. The golden retriever's ears drooped, his soft whines cutting deeper as Jake loaded him into the car. Max pressed his nose to the window as they pulled away, eyes locked on Jake until the house faded from view. The drive to his brother was a silent eternity, and when he handed over the leash, he forced a smile, muttering thanks before retreating to his empty home. The silence hit like a punch. Max's bed sat unused, a stark reminder of Karen's victory. Sleep evaded him that night, anger simmering into something sharper until an idea sparked in the dark. He bolted upright, grabbed his laptop, and dove into research. Emotional support animals. The HOA couldn't ban them, not if he had the right paperwork. The more he read, the more he saw the loophole Karen hadn't anticipated. Federal protections were ironclad and registration was straightforward. A smirk crept across his face. She'd overplayed her hand, and he'd make her regret it. At first, he considered a smaller dog, something under her precious weight limit, but that felt like surrender. This wasn't just about keeping a pet. It was about shoving her tyranny back in her face. If he was going to fight, it had to be bold, unforgettable. Somewhere between exhaustion and defiance, the idea of an ostrich popped into his head. Absurd, yes, but the thought stuck. Could it be an emotional support animal? The internet offered murky answers, but no outright bans surfaced. If he could certify it, the HOA would be powerless. The deeper he dug, the more it grew on him. Ostriches were fast, territorial, oddly charming, and crucially not on any HOA pet blacklist. By dawn, he'd found a breeder named Roy, a no-nonsense guy who didn't blink at the request. With a few calls, Jake secured the paperwork, an ostrich named Kevin, officially his emotional support animal. Roy warned him, "They're stubborn, strong-willed, not like a dog." Jake nodded, half convinced he was ready, though doubt gnawed at him. The day Kevin arrived, chaos descended. The transport truck rolled up and neighbors spilled out, gawking as the 8-foot bird stepped onto the lawn. Karen, mid-mailbox check, dropped her letters, her shriek piercing the air. "What the hell is that?" Karen's shriek still echoed as Jake faced her, holding up Kevin's paperwork with a grin he couldn't suppress. "This is Kevin, my new emotional support animal," he said, savoring the twitch in her eyes as she snatched the documents. The massive ostrich blinked at his new surroundings, his long legs shifting with an elegance both absurd and imposing, while neighbors whispered and kids gaped, one muttering, "Is that a dinosaur?" Karen scanned the pages, her face reddening with each line. "This is not a support animal, it's a wild beast," she spat. Jake kept his tone light. "Legally recognized and per HOA rules, emotional support animals are exempt from your pet bans." She thrust the papers back, fury barely contained as the crowd's murmurs grew, some amused, others baffled. "This is insane," she hissed. "You can't bring a giant bird here." "Why not?" he countered. "The HOA's all about rules, right?" Kevin's allowed. Her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, and for once she had no retort. She stormed off, likely plotting her next move, while Jake's grin widened. He'd won this round. Life with Kevin, though, was a crash course in chaos. The ostrich had no concept of boundaries, following Jake around the yard, pecking at anything shiny, car keys, the mailbox, even a neighbor's watch when they got too close. His sudden sprints at full speed sent Jake's heart racing, and the first time Kevin bolted down the sidewalk, a woman shrieked, clutching her groceries. Adjusting wasn't easy. Roy had undersold how stubborn ostriches could be, and Jake's attempts at containment, a makeshift pen, lasted until Kevin kicked it apart with one powerful leg. Neighbors split on him. Kids adored the bird, dubbing him a superhero, while others muttered about the noise, especially Kevin's dawn drumbeat calls that rattled windows. Karen predictably didn't let it slide. Fines started piling up within days, not directly about Kevin, but clearly aimed at Jake. Noise violations, landscaping gripes, even a claim his mailbox was the wrong beige. He stacked them neatly, plotting his counterattack. She was desperate, and he wasn't backing down. One evening, his friend Mike dropped by, laughing as Kevin strutted past, eyeing the fence for something to steal. "I thought you lost it," Mike said, shaking his head. "But this is genius." Jake chuckled. "Genius or insanity, I'm not sure yet. I might be in over my head." Mike watched Kevin peck at a hose. "So what's next? Karen's not quitting." Jake's gaze drifted to her house across the street, her curtains twitching. "She wants to play dirty, fine. She's bent the rules for years, getting away with whatever she wants. It's time someone flipped the script." Mike smirked. "You've got proof." "Not yet," Jake admitted, "but give me a few days." As Mike left, Jake settled back, watching Kevin inspect the hose like a treasure. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about exposing Karen, stripping her of the power she'd wielded too long. Kevin was the perfect distraction, buying him time to dig. He'd always suspected she wasn't as clean as she pretended. The HOA was her kingdom, but kingdoms fall when the cracks show. He started the next day, combing through bylaws and old records, hunting for anything she'd buried. It didn't take long to find hints. Her oversized shed, unapproved mods to her house, complaints dismissed under her watch. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Karen's control was built on hypocrisy, and he was about to bring it crashing down. Jake's late-night digging into Karen's HOA reign paid off faster than he'd expected. The records weren't public, but a few board members, tired of her iron grip, slipped him financial reports and passed rule changes after some coaxing. Patterns emerged like weeds in her perfect lawn. Karen had twisted regulations for years, always cloaked as community benefit. Yet whenever a rule clashed with her interests, it vanished or bent. Her massive backyard shed, which she claimed was grandfathered in, had no permit. Old complaints about it had been filed and mysteriously quashed. Her house sported unapproved fencing and trim tweaks, violations she'd have crucified anyone else for. It was a goldmine of hypocrisy. She'd find neighbors for trivialities like colorful pots or off-shade doors while her own breaches went unchecked. The HOA wasn't a community tool under her. It was her personal fiefdom, selectively enforced to shield her allies and punish her foes. Jake gathered evidence with grim satisfaction, snapping photos of her shed, collecting dismissed complaints, and digging up meeting notes where she'd rammed through self-serving rules. Each piece fueled his resolve. If she wanted war, he'd bury her under her own bylaws. Next, he turned to the neighbors. Most feared her, resigned to her control, but he had proof now, a weapon no one else had wielded. He started small, chatting over fences, casually mentioning Karen's double standards. Skepticism met him at first, but the photos and records shifted the tide. Frustration flared into anger as they saw her game laid bare. A retired couple shared how she'd find them for a too-bright plant. A single mom recounted repainting her door under duress while Karen's trim flaunted the same rules. Stories poured out, years of bullying masked as order, and Jake knew he had them. The next HOA meeting called to address disturbances. Reed, Kevin, was his stage. The room buzzed with more attendees than usual, word of a showdown spreading like wildfire. Karen sat up front, poised and smug, ready to pivot the agenda against him, but Jake stole the spotlight. "Before Karen airs her latest complaints," he said, voice steady, "let's discuss something else, her breaking rules while enforcing them on us." Her smile faltered. "Jake, this isn't the time," she snapped, but he pressed on, laying out the folder. Piece by piece, he exposed her, the shed, the mods, the dismissed complaints, all while her bored cronies squirmed. The room hummed with shock, murmurs turned to outrage as he detailed her selective tyranny. "Those were approved exceptions," she stammered, laughter tight. "Where's the paperwork?" he shot back. "Why do you get breaks no one else does?" He faced the board. "Have you ever signed off on her exemptions?" Silence answered, heavy and damning. Karen's face flushed. She sputtered about witch hunts and her tireless work, but the tide had turned. A man in the back cut in. "You've controlled us, not helped us." A woman stood. "We're done with it." The room erupted, years of resentment boiling over. Greg, the timid board member, coughed. "Maybe it's time for new leadership." Karen paled. Jake slid out the bylaws. "Actually, we can an emergency no-confidence vote with enough signatures. We've got them." Her fists balled, but the vote was swift and brutal. She was ousted as president. She stormed out, chair scraping, as cheers broke loose. Jake exhaled, the weight lifting. Kevin's head poked through the window, watching with blank curiosity, and Jake grinned. Freedom tasted sweet. Karen's ousting should have ended the storm, but Jake knew her too well. She'd never slink away quietly after such a public fall. The night after the vote, the neighborhood hummed with a rare lightness. Folks toasted her exit in small clusters, relishing the absence of her shadow, while Jake sat on his porch, beer in hand, watching Kevin strut like he'd toppled her himself. It felt good, too still. Then at 2:37 a.m., a pounding on his door jolted him awake. He stumbled downstairs, expecting another petty HOA slip, only to find two cops on his stoop, Karen smirking behind them. One officer, stifling a sigh, flipped his notepad. "Mr. Parker, we got a report of an exotic animal causing a disturbance." Jake rubbed his eyes, pointing at Kevin, sprawled asleep in the yard, neck flopped comically over the grass. "That's him." Karen surged forward, arms crossed. "That thing's a menace, aggressive, loose, scaring people." The second cop raised a hand. "Ma'am, we'll handle it." Jake's patience thinned. "Does he look loose? He's dead asleep." The first officer nodded, unimpressed by her drama. "Sir, we need to check. Got documentation he's legal." Jake handed over Kevin's emotional support papers. The cop skimmed, nodded, and passed them back. "Looks fine." He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, without evidence of trouble, we can't act." Her face twisted. "You're letting this slide." "We can't remove him just because you hate him," the cop said, weary. She let out a guttural noise, stomped off muttering, and the officers tipped apologetic nods before leaving. By morning, her flop was neighborhood gossip, plastered on the Facebook group with memes. Kevin in sunglasses captioned, "Still standing," got the most likes. Jake figured she'd quit, but Karen doubled down, filing a lawsuit claiming Kevin threatened the community's safety and moral integrity. She'd lost it, he thought, but he wasn't fazed. Her case was emotion, not evidence, and he had the law on his side. The court date rolled around, turning the saga into a local circus. Reporters camped outside the county courtroom as Karen marched in with a PowerPoint and a stack of papers. She ranted for 20 minutes, calling Kevin an agent of chaos, flashing blurry photos of him pecking at random objects, her voice rising with theatrical flair as she painted herself a martyr. The judge barely hid his boredom. Jake kept it tight. He presented Kevin's registration, documented Karen's vendetta, and offered neighbor testimonies vouching for the bird. The ruling came fast, lawsuit dismissed, Karen stuck with legal fees. She glared as they left, venom in her whisper. "You'll regret this," he smiled. "I already don't." Back home, the neighborhood shifted. The new HOA leadership ditched petty fines for real fixes, park repairs, pool upgrades, breathing life into a place long stifled. Laughter replaced tension, and Kevin thrived, a kid magnet with his quirky charm. Someone floated making him the mascot, a vote passed in a landslide. Weeks later, Jake hosted a barbecue to bury the Karen era. Nearly everyone came, bearing food, drinks, and a cake topped with a cartoon ostrich and long live Kevin. The vibe was electric, lighter than ever, and as dusk fell, Max bounded in. His brother's move beyond HOA turf brought the golden retriever home. Jake scratched his fur, grinning as Kevin nudged Max, sparking a chaotic chase around the yard that left everyone howling. Victory wasn't just sweet, it was loud, feathered, and gloriously messy. The barbecue buzzed with a joy Jake hadn't felt in years, the neighborhood finally unshackled from Karen's grip. Kids darted around, adults swapped stories over beers, and the cake's ostrich icing drew laughs as Max and Kevin turned the yard into their chaotic playground. Mike sidled up, watching the duo dodge chairs and people with a grin. "This all started because you wanted to keep your dog," he said, shaking his head. Jake took a sip of his drink, eyes on Max's wagging tail. "Yeah, and now I've got an ostrich, a mascot, and a Karen-free zone. Worked out pretty well." Mike chuckled. "Normal life's off the table now, huh?" "Wouldn't have it any other way," Jake replied, zero regret in his voice as Kevin pecked at a fallen chip. The night cemented a new era. People lingered late, reluctant to leave the lightness behind, and Jake slept better than he had in months. Max sprawled across his feet again. But Karen wasn't done lurking. She'd lost everything, her presidency, her lawsuit, her pride, and Jake sensed she'd claw back somehow. It started small, odd glances from her porch, her poodle Oliver glaring like a disgraced noble, then escalated to passive-aggressive notes slipped under his door about yard maintenance or noise, despite her lack of authority. He tossed them in the trash, unbothered. She was a ghost of her former reign, powerless but stubborn. Then came the rumors, whispers she spread through her dwindling loyalists. Kevin had chased a kid, pecked a car, even plotting something sinister. None stuck, neighbors laughed them off, too fond of their feathered celebrity to buy her tailies. Still, Jake stayed vigilant, knowing her desperation could turn ugly. One morning, he found tire tracks near Kevin's pen, too close for comfort, and a broken latch. Someone had tampered with it. He had no proof, but Karen's sour face across the street as he fixed it said enough. He installed a cheap camera just in case, and life rolled on. Kevin strutted, Max barked, and the neighborhood thrived. The real test came at the annual community fair, a low-key event turned spectacle by Kevin's fame. Kids begged for ostrich rides, vendors sold Kevin the King t-shirts, and Jake leaned into it, letting him parade like royalty. Karen showed up, uninvited, hovering at the edges with a clipboard, scribbling furiously, probably drafting some new complaint. When Kevin ambled near her, she flinched, dropping her pen, and he snatched it up, prancing off as the crowd roared. She stormed away, humiliated again, and Jake figured that might have been her breaking point. Days later, a for sale sign sprouted in her yard. No fanfare, no goodbye, just a quiet retreat. Word spread she'd taken a condo downtown, far from ostriches and HOAs she couldn't control. The neighborhood exhaled. Her absence felt like a final victory, though Jake half expected her to pop up someday, still clutching her grudge. With her gone, the HOA rewrote its rules. Common sense stuff, no weight limits or petty bans, just guidelines to keep peace without choking freedom. Kevin's mascot status got official perks. A custom pen, donated treats, even a plaque at the park reading, "Kevin, Guardian of Chaos and Liberty." Max settled back into routines, his golden fur a constant beside Jake, while Kevin added spice, daily sprints, beak nudges, the odd stolen sock. Reflecting on it, Jake marveled at the absurdity. A dog ban had sparked a rebellion, toppled a tyrant, and left him with two unlikely heroes. Normal? No. Perfect. Close enough. Corinne's for sale sign marked the end of an era, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling her shadow might linger. She'd fled to a downtown condo, away from Kevin's reign and the HOA she once ruled, yet her exit felt too quiet for someone so venomous. The neighborhood didn't dwell. Her absence unleashed a freedom they hadn't known, and they leaned into it hard. The fair's success spurred more events. Picnics, movie nights, even a Kevin Day, where kids painted ostrich portraits and Max got extra belly rubs. Jake watched it unfold from his porch, Max sprawled beside him, Kevin preening nearby like a feathered lord. It was surreal, this peace born from chaos, and he savored every second. The HOA, now led by Greg and a few level-headed newcomers, scrapped the old rulebook for something sane. No more dog bans or beige mailbox mandates, just practical stuff to keep the place running. Kevin's pen got an upgrade, funded by a bake sale, and his plaque at the park gleamed under the sun, a testament to his accidental revolution. Life settled into a rhythm. Max's morning walks, Kevin's unpredictable dashes, neighbors waving instead of whispering complaints. Still, Jake kept that camera rolling. Corinne's tire track stunt had left him cautious, and he wasn't about to let his guard slip entirely. Months passed without a peep. Her house sold to a young couple who adored Kevin on sight, and the last whispers of her faded. Then one crisp Saturday, a letter arrived, not HOA stamped, just plain white with her spiky handwriting. He opened it, half expecting venom, but found something else. "Jake, you win. I'm done fighting. Keep your damn bird. Corinne." No apology, no warmth, just surrender, and it hit him. She'd finally broken. He tossed it in the drawer, a relic of the war, and moved on. She didn't deserve more thought than that. The neighborhood kept evolving, shedding its old skin. People planted wild gardens, painted doors bright, let dogs roam without fear of fines. Kevin and Max became the unofficial welcome crew, greeting newbies with a bark and a peck, while Jake's house turned into a hub, his porch a nightly hangout spot. Mike dropped by often, still marveling at the saga. "You turned a dog ban into this," he'd say, gesturing at the laughing kids and Kevin's latest theft. A frisbee this time. Jake just grinned. It wasn't planned, but it worked. One evening, as summer faded, he sat with Max's head in his lap, Kevin eyeing a moth, and realized how deep the change ran, not just rules, but the vibe, the trust. He fought for Max, stumbled into Kevin, and somehow freed a whole community. The absurdity still tickled him, an ostrich as the key to it all. Then came the call, his brother moving again, closer this time, meaning Max could stay for good, no more temporary stints. Jake whooped, Max barked, and Kevin let out a triumphant grunt as if he'd orchestrated it. The next weekend, they threw another bash, less about Corinne's fall, more about roots and reclaiming home. Folks brought potluck dishes, kids chased Kevin, Max rolled in the grass, and Jake felt it. This was his place, quirks and all. Normalcy might have dodged him, but this loud, messy life fit better than he'd ever imagined. As the stars peeked out, he raised a glass to the chaos, the victory, and the duo who'd made it possible. Feathers, fur, and a fight worth winning. The second bash solidified the neighborhood's new heartbeat, a celebration not of Corinne's defeat but of belonging, stitched together by potlucks and laughter. Max rolled in the grass, tail a blur, while Kevin dodged kids' grabs, snagging a sandwich when no one looked, and Jake watched it all from his porch, glass raised to a life he'd never scripted. His brother's move sealed Max's return for good. No more goodbyes, just the golden retriever's steady presence beside him, a quiet anchor to Kevin's wild flair. The night stretched late, stars winking as neighbors swapped tailies of the ostrich saga, now legend, and Jake felt the roots he'd fought for sink deeper. This wasn't just a win, it was home. Corinne's letter sat forgotten in a drawer, her condo exile a distant blip. She'd lost more than power, she'd lost relevance, and the neighborhood bloomed without her. The HOA's new rules stuck: simple, fair, no petty traps, and people embraced the freedom, planting unruly flowers, painting fences odd colors, letting dogs bark without dread. Kevin's pen stood proud, his plaque a quirky landmark, and Max's bed reclaimed its spot by the couch, both fixtures as vital as the air. Daily life took on a rhythm Jake adored. Max's dawn nudges, Kevin's beak tapping the window, neighbors popping by with treats or gossip. The camera stayed up, but its footage showed only Kevin's antics. No tire tracks, no threats, just peace. Mike, ever the skeptic, swung by one afternoon, eyeing Kevin chase a leaf. "You flipped a dog ban into a revolution," he said, half laughing. "Most people would have moved." Jake shrugged, scratching Max's ears. "Most people don't get an ostrich out of spite." Mike grinned. "True, you're stuck with this madness now." "Wouldn't trade it," Jake replied, meaning it. Normal was overrated when you had this. As fall crept in, the community leaned harder into its quirks. A Halloween parade featured Kevin in a cape, Max trailing with a pumpkin hat, and kids chanting their names like superheroes. The young couple in Corinne's old house hosted a bonfire, toasting the bird who'd scared off their tyrant, and Jake saw how Kevin and Max had woven into the fabric here, not just his, but everyone's. One quiet night he sat with Max snoozing, Kevin roosting outside, and traced the journey. A stiff HOA notice, a golden retriever's exile, an ostrich's arrival, and a dictator's fall. It started with saving Max, but it ended with something bigger, a neighborhood reborn, a life reshaped. He'd stumbled into chaos, wielded it like a blade, and carved out freedom. Kevin's absurdity had been the spark, Max's return the reward. The next morning, a kid left a drawing on his step. Kevin and Max as kings, crowns crooked, and Jake pinned it to the fridge, a trophy of the war. Years later, folks still told the tale, how a man, a dog, and an ostrich toppled an HOA queen, how feathers and fur rewrote the rules. Jake aged with Max by his side, Kevin outliving them both, a graying bird still strutting like he owned the place. When people asked why he'd done it, why the ostrich, why the fight, he'd just smile, point to Max's old collar, then Kevin's pen, and say, "Because they're worth it." And they were. Every peck, every bark, every clash had built this loud, messy, perfect world. One he'd never trade for quiet, one that proved sometimes the wildest moves win the sweetest peace.